Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you to the Oldie for inviting me to this prestigious occasion. I feel almost like a celebrity, which I think is as good as it's ever going to get. So, thank you very much. I've been writing about London for 40 years, and oddly, the First World War has been a component of my writing, at least for the first 3 books I wrote. It was the end point of my first book, which was the story of a Jewish East End tenement block in Spitalfields. It was the beginning point of a book that I wrote about a slum street in Islington, in Finsbury Park, focusing on the interwar years, and it became a turning point in my study of London in the 20th century, because I think that London in the First World War is one of the sort of great under-regarded periods of this city's history over the past 100 years or so. And I've long been struck by the very great contrast there is between London's experience of war twice during the 20th century. The First World War, despite its terrible losses, something like 100,000 London men lost in action, mainly on the Western Front. Yet despite that, an extremely positive, optimistic time for the city, a time of extraordinary economic growth, of liberation for women, of a political alliance, I think, with progressive politics that had been largely absent in London before the First World War, and indeed the seedbed of the extraordinary growth of this city in the 1920s and 30s, when London doubles in size on the ground, and when it reached in 1939 its historic high population level of about 8.6 million, which we've just recovered to, I think, in 2015. And you contrast that with the Second World War, so destructive, I think, in many ways. We all think of the Blitz and the enormous damage that caused, but destructive too in terms of the thinking about London, which war heralded. But somehow London was too large, too economically dominant in the country, and that it needed to be put in its place and to lose population and lose industry, with the effect that something like 2 million people left the city between 1945 and 1986. So the Second World War was a harbinger to a period of great economic decline, I think, in this century, an extraordinary contrast from the first. I've tried to capture in the book some of these bigger questions as they impact on London's life in the 20th century. So the extraordinary wartime economy and the increase of manufacturing here that played such a part in the boost of the city in the 20s and 30s. The revolution in women's lives, admittedly set back after 1919, but which was a liberating moment for so many women in London in the First World War. The extraordinary rise in working class living standards, which for a few years at least almost eliminated the levels of Victorian poverty that had been so prevalent before. The rise of the housing problem, in particular in London during these years, because no housing was built and many scores of thousands of people came here to live, and two, the rise of the connection between London and the Labour Party, which is still having an impact, as we saw in the general election of 2015. Alongside this was the day-to-day drama of London in the First World War. The air raids, 26 of them in all, I mean, trivial compared to the experience of the next war, but terrifying and seen as an assault on civilization by those people who experienced it in the city, killing 668 Londoners, wounding something like 2,000 more, and causing countless fires and scores of thousands of pounds of damage. The hospitals of London, which became supplemented by wartime War Office hospitals too, but the London hospitals became the receptacles of wounded soldiers from all over the world, so that Australians from Gallipoli ended up here, British troops from Mesopotamia, and of course, the scores and scores of thousands of troops coming back wounded from the Western Front. I tried to cover too the sort of day-to-day impact of the war on some representative London institutions, the London Hospital, say, or the Reform, not very far away, in Pall Mall, or the children of the Church of England Children's Homes, or Sainsbury's, or various other institutions, and follow these places through the war, and just to see how the war changed things. I've looked at shortages, queuing, rationing, and the impact of the blackout, particularly on the West End, where the West End recovered, and indeed I think became the sort of kernel of Britain's entertainment life during these years, where every soldier who came to Britain or was bred here, as it were, for the army, travelled through London. And so that the West End is full of soldiers from all over the provinces of Britain, from New Zealand, from Australia, from Canada, and after the summer of 1917, from America too. And I've tried to cover things about the anxieties of prostitution and sex in London, which became such a nightmare for the Puritans in the city. And I've tried to look at something of the economy of sex for trade, in particular in the Waterloo Road area of South London. The Waterloo Road area, of course, next to Waterloo Station, and the stations became, in many ways, the epicenter of the London experience of war, because it was through the stations that people got closest to the Western Front, seeing men off as they left for the front, and seeing the injured men back, and the huge, endless cavalcades of ambulances that stretched from Charing Cross, Waterloo, Victoria, to hospitals all over London after July 1916, and the Battle of the Somme. And I'm just going to leave you with a paragraph, which I've quoted in the book. It's not written by me, so it's not a better, I might say, which I think sort of exemplifies this sense of the station as being at the heart of the London experience in the First World War. It comes from the diary of Lady Ian Hamilton, and she was saying goodbye to her husband at Charing Cross Station on 13 March 1915. Hamilton was off to Gallipoli to lead the Allied forces in that desperately sad campaign. At the last moment, I went up to Ian, and he turned hastily and kissed me through my veil. And I pulled it up and said, "Not through my veil, darling, it's unlucky." He kissed me again, but it had vexed and put him out, and he said impatiently, "Why do you say that? Too bad to say unlucky." I felt awful, and put my head in at the carriage door to say, "I only didn't want you to kiss me through my veil." And he said rather crossly, "Well, if it is unlucky, you shouldn't have said it." This saddened me terribly. Frances Horner, a friend of hers with whom she'd come to the station, seized me and said, "Don't watch him out of sight. It's unlucky."